What separates an ordinary day from a disaster? One moment, one wrong step, one decision made blindly. We live in a world where humanity has conquered nature, built cities of glass and steel, and charted routes across oceans and skies. We feel safe. We think the walls of our homes, the hulls of ships, and the fuselages of airplanes are impenetrable armor. But it's just an illusion. Nature makes no deals. It knows no mercy. When a storm rages, when mountains collapse, when fire devours the sky, this armor cracks like an eggshell. And then humanity is left alone with primordial terror, alone with cold, darkness, pain, and despair. What happens in a person's soul when the ground disappears beneath their feet? When the last hope melts like a snowflake in the palm of your hand? Most break. They give up, submit to fate. But there are others, those who cling to life with superhuman strength, those who stare into the abyss and refuse to blink. Today, we will tell you 8 stories. 8 stories of how fragile human life hung by a thread. These are not fiction. These are chronicles of real disasters, where the will to survive collided with the relentless power of nature. We will dive into the icy waters of the North Sea, peer into the chasms of the Alps, traverse burning jungles, and descend into pitch-black underground caverns. These stories are not about death. They are about what it means to be alive. About that spark that drives you to fight when fighting seems impossible. Prepare yourself. Our journey to the edge of human limits begins. Right now, the North Sea rarely shows mercy, but that day it decided to reveal its full fury. A massive passenger ferry, a floating city, sailed its usual course. On board, a carefree atmosphere reigned. Laughter in the restaurants, music in the bars, hundreds of people confident that the steel giant could withstand any storm. They were wrong. The storm struck suddenly. The sky, gray just an hour ago, blackened, merging with the horizon. The wind howled like a wounded beast, and the waves began to rise before their eyes. At first, they were just high, then enormous. Soon they became moving mountains of water, crashing onto the deck with a roar. The ship, seemingly invincible in port, now felt like a fragile splinter in the hands of nature. Panic grew slowly, then flared like a forest fire. Metal screeched through the vessel as the engine failed. The ferry lost power, becoming a helpless toy for the waves. It was rolled sideways, exposing its most vulnerable side to the merciless blows. The lights flickered and went out. The ship plunged into darkness, broken only by flashes of lightning and emergency lights. Screams mingled with the wind's howl. The crew tried to organize evacuation, but it was nearly impossible. Lifeboats, meant to be salvation, turned into death traps. The wind ripped them from their mounts, threw them overboard, or flipped them instantly. Amid this chaos was a man, a tourist from Poland named Andre. Like everyone else, he wore a life jacket but knew the odds were slim. Another massive wave swept the deck, washing everything away. Andre lost his footing and felt his body plunged into the icy abyss. The North Sea's water at this time of year was just a few degrees above freezing. The shock was like an electric jolt. It paralyzed the body and knocked the breath out of him. Around him, others struggled, but their screams quickly faded. In such water, a person can survive only 15, maybe 20 minutes before fatal hypothermia sets in. Andre nearly gave up when his hand struck something solid. It was a piece of a large wooden crate. Summoning his last strength, he climbed onto it. It wasn't a boat or a raft, just a few nailed-together planks barely keeping him afloat. Then began the waiting. Minutes stretched into eternity. Every wave threatened to throw him back into the freezing water. The wind cut to the bone. His body stopped trembling and began to stiffen, a sure sign that his body was surrendering. He closed his eyes and saw the faces of his wife and children. That image, that memory of warmth and love, became his only anchor in a freezing world. He didn't know how much time had passed. Consciousness began to fade. He no longer felt his arms or legs. Then, through the storm's roar, he heard another sound, a low, steady hum. He opened his eyes with effort and saw the distant lights of a rescue helicopter. When they found him, he had been in the freezing water for almost an hour and a half. 90 minutes where death comes in 20. The rescuers couldn't believe their eyes. His body was like a block of ice. He barely breathed. But he was alive. Doctors later called it a miracle, a violation of all physiological laws. Andre, regaining consciousness, would say it wasn't luck, it was the promise he made in his mind to his family, a promise to return home. The Alps, majestic and beautiful, their snow-capped peaks draw people like a magnet. They bring freedom, awe, and the thrill of conquest. But the mountains do not forgive mistakes. Silent, yet always ready to claim the careless traveler. A group of 5 experienced hikers set out on a difficult trail. The path wound along the edge of a cliff, narrow and covered with scree. On one side, a sheer wall. On the other, a drop of hundreds of meters. They moved cautiously, belaying one another. But sometimes one wrong move is enough. Marcus, one of the hikers, stepped on a loose stone. His foot slipped, and he cried out. His friends turned, but it was too late. They saw only his back disappearing over the edge. A dull impact, then another, and silence. A horrifying, ringing silence. Frozen in shock, his friends crawled to the edge. They dared not hope to see him alive. A fall from such a height usually meant certain death. But what they saw was both a miracle and a nightmare. Marcus was lying on a narrow rock ledge some 30 meters below. He hadn't hit the bottom. His body was caught in a crevice. He was alive, but trapped. They shouted, but he didn't answer. They couldn't climb down without proper gear. It would be suicide. Trying to pull him out risked him falling further into the abyss. After agonizing minutes of discussion, they made the only viable decision. 3 would stay to observe, while 2 fastest would run to the nearest village for help. Below, trapped on the rock, Marcus regained consciousness. First he felt a sharp, piercing pain in his leg. He tried to move, but his body was wedged tight. Looking up, he saw a tiny patch of sky and his friends' faces, like small dots. He heard their shouts, but couldn't respond. Each movement brought new flashes of pain. Then they were gone. He was alone. Alone with pain, fear, and the hollow wind singing a mournful song. Hours crawled painfully. The sun began to set. Shadows thickened in the ravine. Cold bit harder. His leg was broken in multiple places. He focused on breathing. Inhale. Exhale. He listened to the sounds of the mountains, the rustle of rocks, distant bird cries, the wind's howl. With dusk, fear intensified. The rocks seemed to close in, trying to crush him. Each minute of solitude in cold darkness was torture. He began to lose consciousness, slipping into a delirious haze. Unknown to him, a rescue operation had already begun above. Professional climbers descended in full darkness, lighting the rocks with powerful flashlights. When they reached him, 8 hours had passed. 8 hours alone, 30 meters above the abyss, with a shattered leg. His body was cold, his breathing barely perceptible. Rescuers worked with surgical precision. One wrong move could be his last. They secured him to special stretchers and began a slow, grueling ascent. When he was brought up, he was at death's door. But he survived. Doctors said it was because his body was tightly wedged. It slowed blood loss and protected him from the wind. But those who saw his eyes knew it was something more. Incredible willpower that refused to let him surrender in that cold, dark abyss. South America. A vast green sea of jungle, over which a small propeller plane flew. On board were 46 people, locals, tourists, business travelers. An ordinary flight, one of hundreds. Passengers napped, read, or gazed at the clouds below. No one suspected that their world would be turned upside down in half an hour. Weather deteriorated rapidly. The plane entered a storm front. Clouds thickened, turning day into twilight. Severe turbulence began. The plane was tossed like a toy. Cabin lights went out. Fearful cries rang out. And that was only the beginning. A blinding flash lit the cabin, immediately followed by a deafening crack, like an explosion. Lightning struck the right wing. Passengers by the windows screamed in terror. The wing caught fire. Flames greedily licked the metal, reaching toward the fuselage. In the cockpit, tension was desperate. Instruments failed one by one. The plane rapidly lost altitude. Communication with the ground was lost. Below, only jungle. Hundreds of kilometers of impenetrable forest, with no clearings or roads. Pilots realized reaching an airport was impossible. They had only one chance, 1 in a million, to attempt a landing in the trees. The captain addressed the cabin. His voice was calm but steely. "Attention, emergency landing. Brace yourselves, heads down." These were the last words passengers heard. The plane hurtled toward the ground. Treetops grew closer. They no longer looked like soft green carpet, but a thicket of giant spikes, ready to pierce the falling aircraft. Impact. Metal screeching, trees snapping. Then, a deafening, absolute silence. Of the 46 on board, only 12 survived. They came to among wreckage, in the dim light of the ravaged forest. Bodies, personal items, pieces of fuselage lay around. Survivors were in shock, many injured. Among them was 17-year-old Juliana, who lost her mother. The first hours were spent in numbness, awaiting rescuers. But hours stretched into a day. Help did not arrive. Deep in the jungle, far from any routes, their chances of being found were negligible. Food and water ran out quickly. On the second day, Juliana made a decision. She would not sit and wait for death. She would seek help. Some tried to dissuade her, but she was resolute. She had lost everything except hope. Barefoot, in torn clothes, she set out through the jungle. It was hell. Thorny vines tore her skin. Poisonous insects bit painfully. Every step was agony. She did not know where she was going, navigating only by the sun. At night, she climbed trees to escape predators and listened to the jungle's terrifying sounds. Hunger and thirst tormented her. She pressed on because she had her mother in mind. She had to survive, for her. By the third day, she was nearly spent. Her legs were raw, her body covered with wounds and bites. She collapsed, convinced it was the end. Then she heard voices. At first, she thought it was a hallucination, but the voices grew louder. Summoning her last strength, she screamed. 2 local hunters found her. They could not believe this emaciated, barely alive girl was one of the plane passengers they had been searching for. Her rescue was a miracle that led to finding the other survivors. Juliana's story is not just about survival. It is about how, in the face of unimaginable tragedy and despair, a fragile girl found the strength to traverse hell and save not only herself but others. She moved through the jungle darkness, guided by the light of her will. Caves, an ancient world of silence and darkness. For speleologists, a place of research and discovery. But sometimes, the underground world becomes a deadly trap. In the Balkans, a group of experienced explorers descended into a little-known cave system. Hours into their research, as they prepared to return, a deep rumble echoed. The ceilings shook. Small rocks fell, then a massive collapse thundered. When the dust settled, they were cut off from the world. Their only known exit was blocked by tons of rock. They were trapped hundreds of meters underground in pitch darkness. Initially, there was no panic. They were professionals. They checked equipment, counted food and water supplies. The main problem, however, was air. In a confined space, oxygen was limited. Every breath brought them closer to death. Hours passed. Attempts to clear the debris failed. The stones were too large. Contact with the surface was impossible. The air grew stale. Despair began to take hold. Then the two most experienced speleologists, Ivan and Pyotr, made a daring decision. They recalled a small, narrow tunnel seen during exploration. It was unstable, dangerous, and no one knew where it led. But it was their only chance. They decided to risk it. Farewells to the rest of the group were brief. All understood Ivan and Pyotr faced likely death. They carried only a coil of rope and one flashlight each. The tunnel was a nightmare. So narrow, they had to squeeze through, pressing against cold, wet rock. Every inch was a struggle. Breathing was nearly impossible, lungs burned. Flashlights illuminated sharp rock jutting out, tearing clothes and skin. After dozens of meters, disaster struck. Pyotr, following second, got stuck. The narrow gap crushed his chest. He could neither breathe nor move. Ivan tried to help, pulling and pushing, but it was useless. In the dim light, he saw life fading from his friend's eyes. Pyotr's last words were a hoarse whisper. "Go save them." Ivan was alone. In the narrow, dark crevice, crushed by grief and guilt. He could have surrendered, laid down beside Pyotr, and waited for the end. But he remembered those words. He remembered those waiting for rescue behind him. Summoning all strength, he crawled on. His hands were cut, his breathing ragged. Consciousness blurred. He moved automatically, driven by one thought: survive. When his strength nearly ran out, he felt a faint airflow, then saw a tiny point of light ahead. He emerged hours later, barely alive. He could not speak, only pointed toward the cave. The rescue operation began immediately. Thanks to Ivan, who at the cost of his friend's life found a way out, dozens of lives were saved. He did not consider himself a hero, but for those he led from the underground darkness, he remained the man who carried a spark of hope through the heart of the mountain. Alaska, land of harsh, pristine beauty and deadly cold. The ocean shows no mercy. The fishing vessel, Northern Star, set out on a routine trip. But this time, nature prepared a trial few could endure. An icy storm struck with the fury of a polar bear. Temperatures dropped to -20. Wind hurled icy grit across the deck, freezing waves, turning the vessel into a frozen ghost. Soon, ice accumulation made the ship dangerously unstable. The captain ordered evacuation. The crew launched a lifeboat. But in the raging ocean, it was no more reliable than a paper boat. A giant wave overturned it, throwing men into the icy water. Most did not survive. Only 3, captain and 2 sailors, climbed onto a large chunk of ice. Their floating island was both salvation and prison. They drifted into open ocean with no food, fresh water, or communication. Around them, a vast icy sea, gray low sky. Wind never abated. The first hours were spent huddling for warmth. Cold was penetrating, numbing muscles, freezing minds. They licked snow for thirst. Hunger had no remedy. The first night was the worst. Darkness, cold, and wind drove them toward madness. They talked to stay awake, recalled homes and families, warm beds. Memories were both support and torture. By the second day, the youngest sailor began hallucinating, seeing village lights, calling his mother. The captain tried to bring him to reality. Too late. Hypothermia and despair took him. He stepped off the ice silently. Only 2 remained, the captain and an older sailor, Lars. They understood remaining meant death. The captain noticed a frozen plank embedded in the ice. "We'll row," he said hoarsely. It seemed insane, rowing a massive ice floe with a small plank in the Arctic Ocean. But action was life. They alternated, rowing furiously for 15 minutes each, trying to steer their icy raft south. It was titanic, exhausting labor. Muscles cramped from cold and fatigue. Hands became numb stumps. Yet they continued. They rowed until consciousness blurred, then rested for a few minutes, and rowed again. A miracle saved them. A Coast Guard helicopter on patrol spotted a dark at the limit of visibility. Approaching, it saw 2 twisted figures, one waving a plank. The men spent more than 2 days on the ice. They survived where survival was impossible. They did not wait, they fought, rowing their frozen vessel toward life, proving human spirit can endure Arctic cold. Coal mine, a world with its own rules. Deep underground, miners extract black gold daily. And one day, risk became reality. A methane explosion thundered like clear sky lightning. Shockwaves smashed tunnels. Communication was lost. 29 miners were trapped in a distant chamber. They were in total darkness, a tangible, oppressive darkness. Only headlamps offered light, and their charge was finite. Miners grouped together for support. The first hours passed in tense waiting. They hammered on rock, hoping to be heard. They believed rescuers were coming. But time passed, and no help arrived. Air became scarce. Breathing was difficult. Fear of suffocation joined fear of the dark. Panic slowly crept in. Some prayed. Some wept. Some stared into emptiness. One miner, an elderly man named Mikhail, did something remarkable. He took a scrap of pencil and paper and began writing. He wrote a letter to his wife. He expressed love, apologized for quarrels, gave guidance to his son. It was a farewell. Others asked for paper, too. In these short notes in the dark was all their life, love, and pain. They did not complain. They said goodbye. An act of courage, thinking of those above, not themselves. Days merged into endless nightmare. Headlamps died. Water ran out. Miners began dying from lack of oxygen and dehydration. Every breath was a struggle. Rescuers worked tirelessly, clearing hundreds of meters of debris. Hope of finding anyone alive dwindled. On the 5th day, a drill hit a void. When rescuers reached the chamber, they found a horrific scene. Among the dead were 7 barely alive miners, immediately brought to sunlight they had thought never to see. This story was remembered not only for the miracle, but for the letters. In pockets of the dead, scraps of paper held last words, a poignant testament. They became a monument to courage and the enduring power of love underground. Arctic, a white desert where nature rules. No room for error. A military transport plane IL-76 made a night flight in polar darkness. Crew and soldiers on board. Initially, all went smoothly, but Arctic weather changes in minutes. The plane hit a blizzard. Visibility dropped to zero. Snow and icy wind created electrostatic discharges, disabling navigation instruments. One compass failed, then another. Autopilot disengaged. The crew was almost blind in the storm. Flying over the uninhabited, frozen wasteland, communication was intermittent. Fuel was low. The experienced pilot realized reaching an airfield was impossible. He made the most desperate decision of his life: land blindly on what he could see. Below was a frozen lake. Radar showed only a flat surface. The plane descended. In the cabin, all held onto seats. Their lives depended on skill and blind luck. Landing lights revealed white streaks through snow. Pilots guided the heavy aircraft with remaining instruments. Touchdown. Landing gear collapsed. Plane slid on the ice with a deafening crack. The ice cracked under the plane's weight, but the hull floated enough to avoid sinking. Half submerged, half on ice. The impact was terrible, yet miraculously no one died. Dazed, survivors began to climb out. New deadly danger awaited: freezing wind. Temperatures were -40, wind unbearable. They gathered on the plane wing to stay warm, huddling, rubbing faces and hands. 14 hours passed on the wing. 14 hours of hell, each minute feeling like the last. They had given up when a faint hum of helicopters reached them. The emergency beacon had worked. Rescuers found them, covered in frost, barely able to move, but alive. This risky blind landing on a frozen lake entered aviation textbooks. For those aboard, it was the longest, coldest night of their lives, when survival depended on pilot skill and extraordinary human spirit. Nepal, land of the highest mountains and ancient mysteries. Far from tourist routes, a group of students decided to shortcut a mountain using an old abandoned tunnel. An engineering tunnel built years ago, usually avoided. Youth was reckless. 6 friends, joking, entered the tunnel. Flashlights on, they went deeper. The tunnel was damp, dark, with water dripping from the ceiling. After half a kilometer, a rumble grew. The ground shook. Rocks fell. Then part of the tunnel collapsed behind them, raising a dust cloud. In panic, they ran forward, only to meet a new horror. Ice-cold water from a damaged underground river surged. They were trapped. Behind, collapse. Ahead, rising water. Flashlights lost. 6 were pressed into a small rock niche, in complete darkness. Time lost all meaning. They did not know day from night. Cold gripped their bodies. It seemed the end. One student, the eldest, died almost instantly. The remaining 5, shivering from cold and fear, struggled to maintain sanity. Then 2 siblings remembered an old miner tradition. They found 2 stones and began tapping. Tuck, 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 tuck. A simple rhythm, but full of hope. They tapped hour after hour, alternating as hands numbed. The sound connected them to the living world, refusing despair. Above, rescuers knew the students were missing. They searched but could not find them. One elderly rescuer familiar with the mountains checked the old tunnel. Seeing fresh collapse, he understood. A rescue operation began. Breaking through was impossible. Special acoustic equipment was brought, listening through rock. Through the thickness, a faint rhythm emerged. Tuck, 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 tuck. It was the signal of life. It gave precise location. Drilling from the mountain top began. Below, 5 trapped students heard it. Rescue was imminent. They were trapped over a day, exhausted, frozen, but alive. Their rescue in Nepal remains a true miracle, made possible by 2 simple stones and unbreakable will. The will of 2 young people to tap a rhythm of hope from their prison. Icy water and blazing sky. Darkness underground and blinding snow. Different places, circumstances, people. But in each story, the same truth shines. The incredible, almost supernatural strength of human spirit. What makes a person cling to a crate in a storm when the body fails? What gives the strength to walk barefoot through the jungle after a crash? What drives tapping stones on tunnel walls when hope is nearly gone? It's not just instinct. It's more. It's will. the will to live stronger than pain, cold, and fear. Love for others, a beacon in darkness. A spark of hope capable of igniting into a flame even in the hopelessest situation. Each story is not just about disaster. It's a test of endurance, humanity, and refusal to surrender when all seems lost. Some survive by miracle, some at the cost of another's life. All remind us of one truth. The most precious thing is every living moment. These people faced death and returned to show how beautiful life is. Their stories are an eternal hymn to courage, sounding through the roar of nature and silence of despair. A hymn proving even the frailest life can be stronger than stone and steel. Thank you for joining us. Subscribe to our channel to hear more incredible stories of survival, disasters, and unbreakable human spirit. Until next time.